Sweet dreams start with a story. If you love drifting off to fascinating tales from the past filled with knights, ancient secrets, forgotten rituals and whispered legends, you're in the right place. Don't miss a single bedtime journey through history. Subscribe and tap the bell so you never sleep through a story again. Sleep well, dream deeper. When most people imagine surgery in the Middle Ages, they conjure a grim scene. A bearded, unwashed man wielding a rusted kitchen blade, bellowing religious slogans while a patient writhes in agony amid Gregorian chants. And yes, such horrors did occur. The medieval era was not short on brutality, superstition, or medical misadventures fueled by desperation and dogma. But to paint the entire period as a wasteland of ignorance would be a profound historical injustice. In truth, medieval medicine was far more nuanced, and occasionally even effective than popular myth suggests. Recent scholarly investigations into medical manuscripts from the 10th through the 14th centuries, combined with archaeological findings from burial sites across Europe, have revealed that medieval surgeons were not merely sadistic amateurs. On the contrary, many demonstrated a surprising degree of skill, particularly in the domains of wound management, cranial surgery, and even ophthalmology. Their tools may have resembled blacksmiths' rejects, crude, iron-forged instruments lacking the finesse of modern scalpels, but their techniques often followed logical, empirically observed principles. Take trepanation, for example, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole into the human skull. While modern audiences might associate this with exorcisms or mystical rituals, venting demons, as some texts put it, the reality was often more pragmatic. Physicians performed trepanation to alleviate intracranial pressure following head trauma, to treat chronic migraines, or to address symptoms we now recognize as epileptic seizures or brain swelling. Far from being a death sentence, archaeological evidence shows that a significant number of patients survived the procedure. Healed bone margins around trepanation sites, discovered in medieval skeletal remains, confirm that not only did individuals live through the operation, but many went on to thrive for years afterward. This was not mindless butchery. It was a calculated, last resort intervention, grounded in observable outcomes. Equally impressive was the sophistication of medieval wound care. Texts such as the Trotula and the Chirurgia Magna, written by scholars like Rogerius Salernitanus, and later expanded by figures such as Guy de Chauliac-Fontaine, detailed instructions for treating battlefield injuries, burns, and infections. These manuals prescribed antiseptic washes made from honey, a natural antibacterial agent, wine, which contains ethanol and polyphenols that inhibit microbial growth, and clean linen bandages. Though they lacked germ theory, medieval practitioners clearly understood that certain substances prevented decay and promoted healing. Their approach was empirical. If a treatment worked repeatedly, it was recorded, refined, and passed down. Dental care, too, defies the stereotype of tooth-pulling brutality. While extractions were common and undoubtedly painful, some surgeons employed more delicate methods. Gold wire was occasionally used to splint and stabilize loose teeth, a technique that foreshadowed modern periodontal treatments. Oral hygiene, though primitive by today's standards, was not ignored. Tooth powders made from crushed rosemary, burnt eggshells, or charcoal were used to clean teeth and freshen breath. These may not have prevented cavities, but they reflect an awareness of oral health that contradicts the image of universally rotting medieval dentition. Of course, not all medieval medicine was rational. Leeches were bled for humoral balance, urine was scrutinized for color and sediment as a diagnostic tool, and suspicious skin lesions could indeed be interpreted as marks of witchcraft, sometimes with fatal consequences. Yet these practices coexisted with genuinely useful interventions. The key insight is this: medieval medicine operated on a spectrum. At one end lay superstition and theological dogma. At the other, careful observation, trial and error learning, and practical skill. Hospitals of the time were not the sterile, compassionate institutions we know today. They were often attached to monasteries, understaffed and chaotic. More akin to shelters for the dying than centres of healing. Yet even within these limitations, caregivers offered food, prayer and basic nursing. And crucially, barber surgeons, those hybrid figures who cut hair by day and amputated limbs by night, were frequently the only medical professionals available to common folk. If you avoided plague, war wounds, and the worst excesses of humoral theory, your chances of surviving an injury under their care were better than many assume. In sum, while medieval medicine was undeniably flawed, it was not uniformly barbaric. It was a patchwork of inherited classical knowledge, Islamic medical advances, transmitted via Spain and Sicily, folk remedies, and hard-won battlefield experience. And in that mosaic, there were glimmers of genuine progress proof that even in the so-called Dark Ages, human ingenuity refused to be extinguished. One of the most enduring caricatures of medieval life is the image of a perpetually grimy, foul-smelling populace shuffling through mud-choked streets in unwashed wool tunics, their bodies caked in grime and their breath reeking of decay. This stereotype has been reinforced by centuries of artistic license, satirical literature, and Hollywood dramatizations that delight in portraying the Middle Ages as a time when cleanliness was not just neglected, it was non-existent. But like many historical clichés, this notion collapses under closer scrutiny. Far from being indifferent to personal hygiene, many medieval Europeans, especially those with access to resources, practiced regular bathing, grooming, and even rudimentary skin care. Archaeological evidence, surviving household inventories, monastic records, and medical treatises all point to a culture that valued cleanliness, albeit in ways that differ significantly from modern standards. The idea that no one bathed between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance is not only inaccurate, it's a product of later historical bias. To begin with, bathing was a common and socially accepted activity throughout much of the medieval period. While daily showers with temperature-controlled water and scented body washes were, of course, beyond reach, weekly or bi-weekly bathing was standard for many. Wealthier households often owned wooden tubs, sometimes lined with cloth or leather for comfort, which servants would fill with hot water heated over a fire. These baths were not merely functional. They were often infused with herbs like rosemary, lavender, or sage for fragrance and perceived medicinal benefits. Soap, though not as refined as today's formulations, was widely used, typically made from animal fat, tallow, and wood ash, yielding a hard, alkaline bar that effectively removed dirt and grease. Public bathhouses, known as stews in England or étuves in France, flourished in urban centres from the 12th through the 15th centuries. Cities like Paris, London and Cologne boasted dozens of such establishments, where citizens of varying social classes could pay a modest fee for a hot bath, a steam session, and sometimes even a massage or hair washing service. These bathhouses were not hidden dens of vice, at least not initially, but legitimate civic amenities often located near markets or churches. In Islamic-influenced regions like Sicily and southern Spain, public bathing followed even more sophisticated traditions inherited from Roman and Arab practices, complete with separate chambers for men and women, heated floors, and intricate tile work. It's true that by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, public bathhouses began to decline in popularity, particularly in Protestant regions, due to growing concerns about morality and disease. The syphilis epidemic that swept through Europe after 1495, coupled with rising religious conservatism during the Reformation, led many authorities to associate communal bathing with promiscuity and contagion. But this shift occurred after the medieval period had ended. To retroactively apply early modern anxieties to the entire Middle Ages is a classic case of chronological distortion. Beyond full-body bathing, medieval people engaged in daily grooming rituals that reflected a genuine concern for appearance and cleanliness. Combs made of bone, wood, or ivory have been found in abundance at archaeological sites across Europe, often intricately carved and clearly valued as personal items. People trimmed their nails, cleaned their ears with small spoons or picks, and plucked unwanted body hair, particularly underarm and pubic hair, with tweezers or even early forms of waxing. Monastic rules, such as those of the Benedictine order, explicitly required monks to wash their hands, faces and feet regularly, and to keep their hair and beards neatly trimmed. Dental hygiene, while primitive, was not ignored. Tooth powders made from crushed charcoal, burnt rosemary, sea salt or even ground-up oyster shells were used to scrub teeth and freshen breath. Mouth rinses often included vinegar, wine, or herbal infusions believed to combat bad humours in the mouth, a pre-scientific but not entirely misguided notion, given that many of these substances have mild antibacterial properties. Wealthy individuals might carry perfumed gloves or chew on cloves and mint leaves to mask odours, demonstrating a clear awareness of social expectations around personal scent. Nobles and courtiers took hygiene even further. Royal households maintained detailed grooming schedules, and aristocratic women used cosmetic preparations like almond milk to soften their skin or rosewater to tone their complexions. Perfumes distilled from flowers, spices and resins were highly prized and often imported at great expense. Far from wallowing in filth, the medieval elite cultivated an image of refinement that included cleanliness as a marker of status and virtue. So where did the myth of the universally filthy medieval person originate? The answer lies largely in the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. As humanist scholars sought to distinguish their own enlightened age from what they dismissed as the Dark Ages, they painted medieval society as backward, superstitious, and unclean. Writers like Petrarch and later Voltaire used exaggerated descriptions of medieval squalor to elevate their own eras as pinnacles of reason and progress. This narrative was further cemented in the 19th century by Victorian illustrators and novelists, who, steeped in their own moralistic views of history, depicted medieval peasants as ragged, lice-ridden figures wallowing in muck more for dramatic effect than historical accuracy. Of course, it would be naive to claim that everyone in the Middle Ages was clean. A serf working 14-hour days in a manure-fertilized field, living in a one-room hut with a dirt floor and no running water, certainly didn't enjoy the same hygiene opportunities as a Parisian merchant or a Benedictine abbot. Illness, poverty and labour conditions inevitably limited access to clean water and grooming tools for much of the population. But the key point is this: lack of access is not the same as lack of desire. When given the means, medieval people bathed, groomed, and perfumed themselves with enthusiasm. In sum, the everyone stank trope is a gross oversimplification. Medieval hygiene was practical, varied by class and region, and deeply intertwined with religious, medical, and social beliefs. While their methods may seem quaint or even bizarre to modernized gold-tooth wiring, urine-based hair rinses, or bathing in herb-infused goat's milk, they reveal a society that cared about cleanliness, health, and presentation far more than popular culture admits. Imagine standing in a cold stone chapel, your knees trembling not from the chill, but from dread. Before you, a row of hooded monks watches in silence. A priest places a small piece of dry, unleavened bread into your palm, blessed, consecrated, and supposedly infused with divine authority. Eat, he commands, and may God reveal the truth through your throat. This was not a scene from a gothic horror novel or a satirical Monty Python sketch. It was a real judicial practice in parts of medieval Europe, known as the ordeal of the consecrated bread or, more dramatically, the trial by morsel. And yes, your eternal fate, and possibly your earthly one, could hinge on whether you choked on a cracker. Unlike the more infamous ordeals involving firewalking, boiling water, or duels to the death, this method was reserved primarily for clergymen whose souls were already considered under God's direct jurisdiction. The logic was chillingly simple. If you were guilty of the crime you stood accused of, often theft, heresy, or breach of clerical vows, divine justice would physically prevent you from swallowing the holy host. Your throat would close, you'd gag, you might even collapse, and in the eyes of the court that was God himself rendering a verdict. The theological underpinning came from a literal interpretation of biblical passages, particularly those warning that whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. 1 Corinthians 11:27. Medieval theologians took this to mean that divine retribution could manifest physiologically. A liar's body, they believed, would reject the sacred substance as if it were poison. In practice, the ritual was both solemn and theatrical. The accused would be brought before an ecclesiastical tribunal, often after days of fasting and prayer, meant to purify the soul, but also, unintentionally, to dry out the mouth and throat, increasing the risk of choking. The bread itself was typically a small, dense wafer, similar to communion bread, but sometimes deliberately made coarse or stale to heighten the challenge. It was blessed with elaborate rites, invoking saints and angels as divine witnesses. Then came the moment of truth. The accused had to chew and swallow the morsel without hesitation, coughing or visible distress. If he succeeded, he was declared innocent, not because evidence exonerated him, but because God had allowed him to consume the sacred element. If he faltered, even if it was due to nerves, acid reflux, or a pre-existing esophageal condition, he was condemned. No appeals, no second chances. Divine judgment was final. What makes this practice especially unsettling is that it wasn't some fringe superstition practiced in remote villages. It was sanctioned by church authorities and documented in legal and liturgical texts across Anglo-Saxon England, parts of France, and Germany from the 9th through the early 13th centuries. Bishops presided over these trials. Monasteries kept records of outcomes. Entire monastic communities would gather to witness the ordeal, treating it as both a legal proceeding and a spiritual spectacle. Ironically, the system occasionally produced miraculous acquittals that reinforced its perceived legitimacy. A man known to be guilty might swallow the bread smoothly, perhaps because he was calm, practiced deception well, or simply had good digestion, and be declared innocent. The faithful would interpret this not as a flaw in the system, but as evidence of God's mysterious mercy or hidden wisdom. Conversely, an innocent man suffering from anxiety might choke and be burned as a heretic. Such tragedies were chalked up to divine inscrutability. God's ways are not our ways. Over time, however, even the Church began to question the reliability of these divine tests. Critics pointed out that human physiology, not divine, will often determine the outcome. More importantly, the practice seemed to put God on trial, demanding a supernatural sign on command, which many theologians came to view as presumptuous, even blasphemous. The turning point came in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, convened by Pope Innocent III. In Canon 18 of the Council's decrees, the Church officially banned clergy from participating in ordeals of any kind, including trial by fire, water, and consecrated bread. The reasoning was twofold. First, such practices amounted to tempting God. Second, they undermined the emerging principles of rational jurisprudence that were beginning to take root in canon and civil law. Without priests to bless the bread or monks to oversee the ritual, the ordeal of the morsel quickly faded into obscurity. By the mid-13th century, it had largely disappeared from legal practice, replaced by witness testimony, written records, and in secular courts, torture-based interrogations, which ironically were often more brutal and less reliable. Yet the legacy of this bizarre trial lingers as a powerful reminder of how deeply medieval society intertwined law, faith, and the body. Justice wasn't just about evidence or motive, it was about cosmic alignment. A person's guilt or innocence was believed to resonate through their very flesh, detectable by sacred substances and divine intervention. In a world without forensic science, DNA, or even reliable record-keeping, the body itself became the courtroom. Today, the ordeal of the consecrated bread seems absurd, even darkly comic. But to dismiss it as mere ignorance is to miss its deeper significance. It reflects a worldview in which the spiritual and material were inseparable, where every bite of bread could carry the weight of heaven or hell. And while we may no longer let crackers decide criminal cases, the human desire for infallible truth, whether through lie detectors, algorithms, or polygraphs, suggests that the impulse behind the ordeal is not so distant after all. To become a Knight Templar was not a matter of donning a white cloak and charging into battle with a banner. It was a transformation so profound that it demanded the complete annihilation of one's former self. The initiation into this elite military religious order was not a public spectacle, nor was it a joyous celebration. It unfolded in the hushed stillness of pre-dawn, cloaked in secrecy, ritual, and spiritual gravity. Every gesture, every word, every silence carried meaning, designed not to honour the individual, but to dissolve him into something greater, the sacred brotherhood of Christ's militia. The candidate arrived alone, no retinue, no armour, no sword. By custom he came humbly to the gates of a Templar preceptory, a fortified monastery that doubled as barracks, chapel, and treasury. Often a man of noble birth, trained in arms since childhood, he now approached not as a lord or a warrior, but as a supplicant. His lineage, his wealth, even his name all were to be surrendered, for within these walls earthly status meant nothing. Only obedience, purity, and unwavering devotion mattered. The gatekeeper, a brother in plain robes, admitted him without fanfare. Torches flickered in the courtyard, casting long shadows across stone walls still damp with night dew. Silence was enforced. The candidate was forbidden to speak until spoken to. This was his first test not of strength, but of humility. He was led through the cloister and into the chapel, the spiritual heart of the order. Unlike the grand cathedrals of Christendom, adorned with stained glass and gilded altars, a Templar chapel was stark and austere. Its beauty lay in its severity. Stone floors, unadorned walls, and a single altar bearing relics, the true cross, saints' bones, perhaps a gospel manuscript wrapped in silk, created an atmosphere of sacred minimalism. Flickering oil lamps threw dancing shadows, making the relics seem alive with divine presence. This was not a place for comfort, but for confrontation, with God, with duty, and with the self. The brothers assembled in solemn ranks, their white mantles marked with the blood-red cross, a symbol not of violence, but of sacrifice. They stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the solitary figure before them. The candidate, now stripped of all external identity, stood exposed, not just physically, but spiritually. Every movement was choreographed to remind him that he was no longer an individual, but a vessel for a higher cause. As dawn's first light seeped through narrow slits in the chapel walls, the master of the temple stepped forward. He was both father and judge, commander and confessor. The questioning began not as an interrogation, but as a ritual purification of intent. "Do you come of your own free will?" the master asked, "without coercion, deceit, or hidden obligation?" This was no rhetorical formality. The Templars demanded absolute clarity. A man who joined under duress, debt, or delusion was a liability. Worse, he was a blasphemer offering a tainted vow to God. The candidate was pressed further. Was he married? Did he owe allegiance to another lord? Did he carry unresolved sins or secret loyalties? Any hesitation, any ambiguity, could result in immediate rejection. Then came the harder questions, the ones that tested not just honesty, but courage. "You will know no ease," the master warned. "No wealth, no luxury. You will eat plain bread, sleep on straw, and obey commands unto death. You will forsake women, heirs, and the comforts of family. Are you prepared for this life?" These were not empty threats. The Templar life was monastic in discipline and martial in purpose. It blended the austerity of a Cistercian monk with the lethality of a crusading knight. Many candidates, hearing this stark truth for the first time, turned back. The ritual allowed it. Better to walk away now than break a sacred oath later. But if the man stood firm, if his voice did not waver, he was asked one final question. "Do you still wish to remain?" A resolute yes marked the point of no return. With his resolve confirmed, the candidate moved to the heart of the ceremony, the taking of vows. Unlike secular knighthood, which celebrated lineage, honour and conquest, the Templars demanded the opposite. Their three core vows, poverty, chastity and obedience, were not suggestions. They were total, absolute and irrevocable. Poverty meant renouncing all personal property. Any land, gold or inheritance the candidate possessed was immediately surrendered to the order. From this moment on, even his cloak, his sword and his daily bread belonged not to him, but to Christ through the temple. He might have once commanded a castle and 100 vassals. Now he would share a wooden bowl with his brothers. Chastity severed his ties to family and legacy. In a society where noble bloodlines defined power, this vow was radical, even shocking. He swore to love no woman carnally, dedicating all passion to Christ and the Virgin Mary. This was not repression, but redirection. His energy was to fuel prayer and battle, not heirs and estates. Outsiders would later twist this vow into rumours of unnatural practices, but within the order it was seen as spiritual purity. Obedience was the most binding of all. He pledged to follow the commands of his superiors instantly and without question, whether ordered to charge into battle, guard a desert outpost for a decade, or kneel in silent prayer for hours. His will was no longer his own. This vow transformed him from a free knight into a living instrument of the Order's divine mission. Once the vows were spoken, the ritual deepened into a physical act of consecration, the kissing of holy relics. This was no mere gesture. In the medieval mind, relics were conduits of divine power. To kiss a fragment of the true cross or the bone of a martyr was to enter into a sacred covenant with heaven itself. Guided by two senior brothers, the candidate knelt before the altar. He first kissed the cross, a symbolic union with Christ's suffering. Then he pressed his lips to the relics of saints, aligning himself with their legacy of faith and endurance. Each kiss was a seal, binding his soul to his oath. To break that oath would not only bring shame, it would risk eternal damnation. After the relics came the ultimate act of submission, kneeling before the master. In feudal society, kneeling signalled fealty to a lord in exchange for land or protection. But here there were no rewards. The candidate knelt not for gain, but for surrender. His posture echoed that of a vassal, yet stripped of all worldly reciprocity. He offered himself freely, with nothing asked in return. The master placed his hands upon the candidate's bowed head and spoke words of command. From this hour you belong not to yourself, but to God and his temple. Obey, serve, and endure. Then came the moment of communal acceptance. The master turned to the assembled brothers and asked, "Does any man here know just cause why this candidate should not be received into our fellowship?" Silence was consent. If no brother objected, if no hidden sin or broken promise was revealed, the candidate was declared a Templar. At once, the atmosphere shifted. The rigid silence broke. Brothers stepped forward to embrace him, often offering the kiss of peace, a chaste kiss on the cheek symbolizing spiritual kinship. This was not mere courtesy. It was incorporation. He was no longer an outsider. He was family. The final and most iconic act was the investiture with the white mantle. A senior brother brought forth the garment, a plain white cloak, unadorned save for the crimson cross stitched over the heart. White symbolized purity and chastity. Red, the blood of martyrdom. To wear this mantle was to declare oneself dead to the world. As the cloak settled on his shoulders, the master explained its meaning. This is not clothing, but a covenant. If you betray your vows, this mantle will become your curse. Now fully robed, the new knight rose. For the first time he stood visibly as a Templar cloaked in the colours of sacrifice and sanctity. The brothers saw not a man, but a brother bound by the same oath they had sworn. The initiation concluded not with fanfare, but with a shared meal. In the refectory, the new knight sat among his brethren at long wooden tables. The food was simple: bread, broth, beans, perhaps a slice of roasted meat. No wine flowed freely, no music played. Conversation was restrained, often centered on scripture or military matters. This meal was another test. Could he live this life daily? Could he find belonging in austerity? By eating the same food, obeying the same rules, and sharing the same silence, he fully entered the rhythm of Templar existence. Here, nobility meant nothing. A count's son and a blacksmith's apprentice sat side by side, equal in poverty, equal in purpose. Finally, the master offered a closing blessing, invoking Christ, the Virgin, and the saints as eternal witnesses. Latin chants rose from the brothers, their voices echoing off stone walls, a wave of devotion that sealed the new knight into the order's spiritual lineage. When he stepped out of the chapel that morning, the world saw only a man in a white cloak. But within the brotherhood, he was something far greater, a soul remade, a warrior consecrated, a living weapon in the army of God. His old life was ash. His new life had just begun. To step inside a Templar preceptory was to enter a world governed not by the rhythms of commerce, courtship, or even ordinary monastic contemplation, but by a fusion of military precision and spiritual austerity so total that it bordered on the monastic martial sublime. These fortified compounds, scattered from the Scottish borders to the deserts of Outremer, were more than barracks or chapels. They were self-contained universes where every hour, every meal, every breath was calibrated to serve one purpose: the defence of Christendom through unwavering discipline. Life in a preceptory began long before sunrise. Around 2 SM, the silence of the stone halls was broken not by a bell, but by the soft tread of a brother making his rounds. The night watch, often a veteran knight who had seen Jerusalem fall or survived the siege of Acre, would rouse the community with a whispered call, ad matutinum. Matins, the first of the canonical hours, summoned the brothers to prayer in the chapel. There were no luxuries of slumber here. Sleep was a necessity, not a right, and even it was rationed. The chapel, cold and unadorned, filled quickly. Cloaked in their white mantles despite the hour, the Templars knelt on stone floors, their breath visible in the pre-dawn chill. Candles flickered before relics of the true cross and martyred saints, casting long shadows that danced like silent witnesses. The service was conducted in Latin, chanted in low, resonant tones that echoed off vaulted ceilings. No music accompanied them, no organs, no choirs, only the human voice stripped bare, rising in unison to meet the divine. This was not worship as spectacle, it was worship as vigilance. After matins, silence resumed. Not the silence of emptiness, but of intention. The rule of the order compiled under the guidance of Bernard of Clairvaux, and refined over a decade's mandated silentium perpetuum, perpetual silence, except during designated times. Brothers communicated through gestures, nods, or brief functional phrases. This was not mere asceticism, it was tactical. In a world where spies infiltrated camps and traitors whispered in taverns, silence was both spiritual armour and operational security. By 4 a.m. the preceptory stirred with quiet industry. Grooms led horses to the stables for feeding and grooming. Blacksmiths stoked forges to repair chainmail links or sharpen sword edges dulled in training. Cooks began preparing the day's first meal-thin barley porridge, coarse bread, and watered wine served in the refectory by 5 sirbromans sharp. Meals were never lavish. The rule forbade meat except on feast days or for the sick. Even fish was rationed. To eat was not to indulge, but to sustain the body for service. The morning was divided between spiritual and martial duties. After breakfast, the brothers gathered for prime, another brief office of prayer, followed by a reading from Scripture or the Rule. Then came the day's first inspection. Armour polished, weapons oiled, horses saddled. Every knight was responsible for his own gear, but senior sergeants oversaw quality control. A rusted buckle or a loose rivet could mean death in battle, and the order tolerated no negligence. Training began at sunrise. In the central courtyard, squires and knights practised with wooden wasters, shields and blunted lances. Footwork, Shield walls mounted charges. Each drill was executed with mechanical precision. Unlike secular tournaments which glorified individual prowess, Templar training emphasized cohesion. A knight was not a hero. He was a link in a chain. Break one link and the whole formation collapsed. Fencing masters, often grizzled veterans with scars from the Holy Land, corrected posture, timing and discipline with sharp words and sharper sticks. By mid-morning, administrative duties took over. The Templars were not just warriors, they were bankers, diplomats, and estate managers. The preceptor, local commander, held court in the chapter house, reviewing correspondence from other preceptories, auditing accounts, and issuing orders. The order's vast network relied on meticulous record-keeping. Inventories of grain, lists of donations, manifests of pilgrims escorted to Jerusalem. Even their banking operations, issuing letters of credit, managing loans to kings, were handled with monastic rigour. A Templar scribe might spend hours copying ledgers in a script so precise it bordered on devotional. Lunch, served around noon, was the day's main meal, but still modest. Beans, lentils, cheese, and seasonal vegetables formed the core. On rare occasions, roasted fowl or salted pork appeared, usually as alms from a grateful noble. Wine was always diluted with water, typically 2 parts water to 1 part wine, as drunkenness was punishable by flogging. Conversation during meals was limited to readings from the lives of saints, or passages from the Gospels recited aloud by a designated brother. Personal chatter was forbidden. To speak of oneself was to violate the vow of humility. The afternoon varied by season and location. In winter, brothers might repair cloaks, mend harnesses, or study military maps. In summer, they patrolled local roads, escorted merchants, or drilled new recruits. Some preceptories operated farms or vineyards, worked by lay servants or donated serfs. Templar knights oversaw these operations but rarely laboured themselves, though they were expected to understand every aspect of their domain. Efficiency was sacred. Waste was sin. Vespers at sunset marked the transition from labour to contemplation. The brothers returned to the chapel, now lit by the last amber rays of daylight filtering through narrow windows. The chants were slower, more reflective. Here, amidst the scent of beeswax and old stone, even the most hardened knight might allow himself a moment of vulnerability, praying not just for victory but for forgiveness, for clarity, for the strength to endure. Dinner was lighter than lunch, often just bread and broth, and followed by compline, the final office of the day. By 7 p.m, the preceptory was cloaked in near-total silence. Brothers retired to their dormitories, long unheated halls with straw pallets laid side by side. Privacy was non-existent. A knight slept inches from his brothers, his sword within arm's reach. This was by design. Solitude bred doubt. Community bred resolve. Yet even in rest, the Templars remained alert. Night watches rotated every 2 hours. One brother stood guard at the gate, another patrolled the walls, a third kept vigil near the chapel, where the Eucharist was reserved. Fire was a constant threat, as was infiltration. Every shadow was scrutinized, every sound interpreted. What made this life sustainable indeed, compelling, was not fear, but fraternity. Within the preceptory walls all distinctions of birth dissolved. A count's son and a blacksmith's apprentice ate the same bread, knelt on the same stones, and bled the same red. The order's radical equality was its greatest strength. It forged loyalty not through rank, but through shared sacrifice. And yet, beneath the discipline, humanity persisted. Brothers exchanged glances of camaraderie after a grueling drill. A scribe might sketch a tiny cross in the margin of a ledger. An old knight might hum a fragment of a troubadour's song while polishing his spurs, quickly silenced, but not forgotten. These were not robots in white mantles. They were men who had chosen to surrender everything. Family, fortune, freedom, for a cause they believed transcended death. In the end, daily life in a Templar preceptory was less about grand battles and more about the quiet accumulation of virtue through routine. It was in the scrape of a whetstone on steel, the rustle of a page turned at midnight, the shared silence over a bowl of lentils that the Order's true power resided. Not in spectacle, but in steadfastness, not in glory, but in grit. And when the call to crusade finally came, these men did not rush to war with fanfare. They saddled their horses in silence, kissed the relics one last time, and rode east, not as adventurers, but as instruments of a covenant sealed in stone, sweat, and sacrament. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, dawn broke over France, not with the usual chorus of church bells and market cries, but with the clang of iron-shod boots on cobblestone. Across the kingdom, royal bailiffs and soldiers stormed Templar preceptories, dragging knights from their beds, seizing documents, and confiscating treasure. By royal decree, every member of the Knights Templar in France was arrested on the same day, accused not of battlefield failure or financial mismanagement, but of crimes so monstrous they threatened the very soul of Christendom: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, and sodomy. The architect of this coordinated purge was none other than King Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, a man whose golden hair and regal bearing masked a mind sharpened by debt, paranoia, and ruthless ambition. And at the heart of his vendetta lay a simple, brutal truth. He owed the Templars an enormous sum of money. For decades, the Order had functioned as Europe's de facto central bank. Kings borrowed from them to fund wars, popes stored papal revenues in their vaults, and pilgrims carried letters of credit issued by Templar treasurers. Their financial network spanned from London to Acre, and their reputation for integrity was unmatched. But to Philip that integrity was an obstacle. The Templars refused to forgive his debts incurred during costly wars with England and Flanders. Worse, they answered not to him, but to the Pope alone. In a kingdom where royal authority was meant to be absolute, the Templars were a sovereign power within the realm. Philip needed them gone. But how do you destroy a holy order protected by papal bulls and revered across Christendom? You don't attack their wealth. You attack their soul. You don't accuse them of greed. You accuse them of denying Christ. Thus began one of history's most elaborate smear campaigns. Months before the arrests, Philip's ministers, particularly his ruthless adviser Guillaume de Nogaret, had been quietly gathering confessions from disgruntled former Templars and paid informants. These testimonies, extracted through torture or the promise of leniency, formed the backbone of a terrifying indictment. That during initiation rites, new brothers were forced to spit on the cross or trample it underfoot, that they worshipped a mysterious idol called Baphomet, described variously as a cat, a severed head, or a bearded figure with 3 faces, that they engaged in the unnatural acts with one another, violating the vow of chastity in secret orgies, that they denied the divinity of Christ and claimed the Eucharist was powerless. These charges were not random. They struck at the core of medieval Christian identity. To spit on the cross was to reenact the mockery of Christ at Calvary. To deny the Eucharist was to reject the central sacrament of the Church, and to worship idols was to flirt with the devil himself. In an age where heresy was equated with treason against God, such accusations were enough to justify extermination. The arrests were executed with chilling efficiency. Over 130 Templars were seized in Paris alone. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who had served the order for 2 decades and once stood beside kings and popes, was dragged from his bed and thrown into a royal dungeon. There, like hundreds of his brothers, he faced the rack, the strappado, and sleep deprivation methods designed not to uncover truth, but to produce confession. And confess they did. Broken by pain and isolation, many Templars admitted to the very crimes they had never committed. Some described the idol Baphomet in vivid detail, though no 2 descriptions matched. Others claimed they had spat on the cross 3 times, as if reciting a script. These confessions were immediately publicized, circulated by royal scribes to justify the crackdown and turn public opinion against the order. But not all broke. Some knights retracted their confessions once the torture stopped, declaring their innocence before inquisitors. One brother, Geoffroy de Gonville, famously stated, "I confessed because I could bear the pain no longer, but before God I am innocent." Such retractions were dangerous. In the eyes of the Inquisition, to recant a confession of heresy was itself a heretical act, punishable by death. Pope Clement V, weak and politically dependent on Philip, was caught in an impossible bind. The Templars were his spiritual sons, yet Philip was his most powerful secular ally. For years the Pope delayed judgment, demanding trials and investigations. But Philip pressed relentlessly, leaking confessions, staging public burnings of relapsed heretics, and even threatening to put the Pope himself on trial for corruption. Finally, in 1312, under immense pressure, Clement issued the papal bull vox in excelso, officially dissolving the Knights Templar. Not because they were proven guilty, but because the scandal had become too great for the Church to bear. The order was extinguished not by verdict, but by bureaucratic erasure. Its assets were supposed to be transferred to the rival Knights Hospitaller. But in France, Philip ensured that most of the Templar wealth vanished into the royal treasury. The Hospitallers received little. The king got everything. The final act of the tragedy unfolded in March 1314. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, were brought before a public tribunal in Paris. Both had confessed under torture, but later retracted their confessions, declaring the order innocent. For this act of defiance, they were sentenced to death by burning. As the flames rose on the Ile de la Cité, de Molay is said to have turned to the crowd and issued a chilling prophecy. Pope Clement and King Philip will both stand before God within a year to answer for their crimes. Whether apocryphal or true, the words carried eerie weight. Pope Clement V died just 1 month later, of illness, but haunted by guilt. King Philip IV collapsed from a stroke while hunting in November 1314, less than a year after the execution. Guillaume de Nogari, the king's chief inquisitor, had already died in 1313, possibly poisoned. The timing fueled legends. To many it seemed God had indeed rendered judgment. But what of the truth? Modern historians overwhelmingly agree. The charges against the Templars were fabricated. No credible evidence of idol worship, systematic sodomy, or Christ denial has ever been found in Templar documents or archaeology. The so-called Baphomet likely stemmed from a mishearing of Muhammad, a slur implying the Templars had gone native in the East. The spitting on the cross ritual, possibly a garbled distortion of the initiation's demand for absolute obedience, even to acts that seemed blasphemous as a test of faith. In reality, the Templars were devout, disciplined, and orthodox. Their real crime was independence, and their real sin was crediting a king who could not repay his debts. Yet the myth endured. The image of the secretive Templar, whispering dark oaths in candlelit chambers, entered European folklore. Centuries later they would be resurrected as occult masters, guardians of the Holy Grail, and founders of Freemasonry symbols of hidden knowledge and suppressed truth. But in 1307 there was no mystery-only betrayal. The fall of the Templars was not a divine reckoning. It was a financial hit job dressed in the robes of piety, and in its wake Europe learned a brutal lesson. Even the holiest institutions are vulnerable when they stand between a king and his gold. To walk through the narrow streets of ancient Pompeii today is to traverse a city suspended in volcanic time, a metropolis of bakeries, bathhouses, temples and taverns, all preserved beneath a blanket of ash from Mount Vesuvius's catastrophic eruption in 79 CE. Yet among these ruins, one building stands apart not for its grandeur, but for its raw, unfiltered honesty about human nature. The Lupanar, Pompeii's most famous brothel. The name itself is telling. Lupanar derives from the Latin lupa, meaning she-wolf, a slang term for prostitute, evoking an image of women prowling the urban landscape like predators. But in reality, it was the clients who did the prowling, and they didn't need to guess where to go. Carved into the paving stones and walls of Pompeii were unmistakable phallic symbols, pointing like arrows toward the brothel's entrance. This was not hidden vice. It was public infrastructure, part of the city's navigational system, as functional as signs for the forum or the baths. The Lupanar's exterior offered no fanfare. Built of rough-hewn stone, indistinguishable from neighbouring shops or taverns, it blended seamlessly into the working-class district near the Stabian Gate. But step through its narrow doorway, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air grew thick with the mingled scents of cheap wine, olive oil from flickering lamps, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of coins changing hands. Voices echoed bargaining, laughing, whispering, while the walls themselves bore witness in the form of graffiti, frescoes, and centuries of human contact worn into the stone. This was not a den of shame. It was a marketplace of desire, as integral to Pompeii's economy as its grain mills or wine presses. And like any well-run Roman business, it operated with ruthless efficiency, clear pricing, and tiered services. Architecture of intimacy. The Lupanar was a two-story structure, compact yet meticulously organized for maximum throughput. On the ground floor, 5 small rooms, little more than stone-walled cubicles, lined a narrow corridor. Each contained a permanent stone bed, raised slightly off the floor and covered with a thin straw mattress and coarse blanket. Comfort was not the goal. Durability was. These beds had to withstand constant use day and night by men of all classes, from labourers to legionaries. Upstairs, the experience changed. The second floor housed larger, slightly more private rooms, likely reserved for wealthier clients who could afford a premium. Here, wooden beds replaced stone, softer linens might be found, and the promise of discretion carried extra weight. This spatial hierarchy mirrored Roman society itself. Even in the pursuit of pleasure, class distinctions endured. A central stone staircase connected the two levels, a vertical artery pumping commerce through the building. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on walls painted with vivid erotic frescoes, each positioned directly above a doorway like a menu in a restaurant. These were not subtle suggestions or mythological allegories. They were explicit, colourful depictions of sexual acts, missionary, rear entry, oral, even group encounters. In a city where literacy was limited, especially among slaves, foreigners and the lower classes, these images served a practical purpose. A client who couldn't read Latin could simply point to the fresco that matched his preference. This visual catalogue was revolutionary in its clarity. It standardized expectations, reduced misunderstandings, and functioned as permanent advertising. In essence, the Lupanar's walls were its sales team. The women behind the walls, behind every fresco, every graffito, every transaction, stood the women of the Lupanar, most of them enslaved, many foreign-born, and nearly all voiceless in the official records of Roman society. They came from Gaul, Greece, Syria, North Africa, captured in war, sold by impoverished families, or born into bondage. Their identities were often erased and replaced with generic Roman nicknames: Fortunata, Lucky, Prima, First, Myrtle, Myrtle. These names weren't terms of endearment. They were inventory labels. Their daily reality was grueling. From dawn until late into the night, they worked in airless, windowless rooms, servicing client after client for as single as the price of a loaf of bread. The brothel's owner, likely a wealthy Pompeian citizen, collected the earnings. The women kept almost nothing. Their bodies were commodities, their labour a revenue stream. Yet amid this bleakness, traces of individuality and resilience survive. Scratched into the plaster are graffiti that may have come from the women themselves. Names, boasts, even defiant declarations. One inscription reads, Fortunata Felix, Fortunata the Fortunate. Perhaps ironic, perhaps sincere. Another simply etches a heart beside a name, a tiny act of self-assertion in a world that denied them personhood. Legally, these women were classified as infames, a status that stripped them of civic rights. They could not marry respectable citizens, inherit property, or testify in court. Society tolerated their labour but despised their existence. They were essential, yet expendable. Visible, yet invisible. The clients. Everyone and anyone. The Lupanar's clientele was as diverse as Pompeii itself. Soldiers stationed at nearby camps, sailors fresh from the Bay of Naples, merchants counting profits from the Forum, even local elites seeking anonymity. All passed through its doors. For a man in ancient Rome, visiting a prostitute carried no moral stigma. Fidelity was expected of wives, not husbands. In fact, many moralists argued that brothels protected respectable women by channeling male desire into sanctioned outlets. Graffiti on the walls confirm this normalization. One man proudly declares, Hic ego puellas multas futui. Here I fucked many girls. Another specifies, Fortunata mihi bene fuit, numero uno. I had a good time with Fortunata for 1 coin. These inscriptions read like ancient Yelp reviews, boastful, crude, and utterly matter-of-fact. For many, the Lupanar was more than a place of sex. It was a social space part tavern, part club, part stage for performances of masculinity. Men drank, bragged, carved their names, and left behind a legacy in scratched letters. In a culture obsessed with reputation, even a brothel visit could become a claim to virility. Commerce and culture. The lupanar was not an isolated vice den. It was woven into Pompeii's economic fabric. Taverns nearby sold wine to loosen inhibitions. Street vendors hawked snacks to men exiting the brothel. Even the graffiti served a commercial function. Names of popular women became brands, driving repeat business through word of mouth. The state, too, had a stake. Prostitution was legal, regulated, and taxed. Under Emperor Augustus, prostitutes were required to register with local authorities. The lupanar operated not in defiance of Roman law, but within its framework. This paradox, official tolerance paired with social contempt, defined the institution. Preservation by catastrophe. When Vesuvius erupted, it did more than destroy Pompeii. It froze it. While Rome rebuilt itself over centuries, erasing much of its past, Pompeii remained sealed under ash and pumice, preserving the lupanar in astonishing detail. The stone beds still stand. The frescoes retain their vivid colours. The graffiti remains legible, as if written yesterday. For historians, this is invaluable. The lupanar offers a rare, unfiltered glimpse into daily life, not the idealized version found in poetry or philosophy, but the raw, messy reality of human behavior. It reveals a society that commodified sex without shame, yet stigmatized those who provided it. That celebrated male freedom while policing female bodies, that built empires on discipline and pleasure. Today, tourists flock to the lupanar, often with smirks or nervous laughter. But the building deserves more than voyeurism. It is a memorial to the marginalized, to women whose names we barely know, whose labor sustained a city, and whose voices echo faintly in scratches on a wall. It reminds us that history is not just made in senates and battlefields, but in narrow rooms where desire, economics, and power collide. The lupanar endures not as a scandal, but as a truth etched in stone, painted in pigment, and preserved by fire. In the sun-baked hills of Laconia, where olive trees clung to rocky soil, and the wind carried the distant clang of bronze on bronze, love was not a private affair. It was a public obligation. In Sparta, a city-state forged in iron and defined by war marriage was never about candlelit vows, poetic declarations, or the merging of two hearts. It was a civic act, as rigorously managed as military conscription or grain rationing. Every ritual, every custom, every whispered expectation served one master, the survival of Sparta itself. Unlike Athens, where marriage functioned as a vehicle for property transfer, family alliances, and household stability, Sparta viewed the union of man and woman through a single, unblinking lens: eugenics. The goal was not companionship, but the production of children specifically, strong sons who would become unbreakable warriors, and resilient daughters who would bear the next generation of warriors. Personal desire was irrelevant. Romance was a luxury Sparta could not afford. This philosophy permeated every stage of the marital process, from courtship, or lack thereof, to the wedding night and beyond. The result was a system so stark, so utilitarian, that even other Greeks regarded it with a mixture of awe and horror. The timing of union, a state-scheduled affair. Spartan marriage was not entered into on a whim, or at the peak of youthful passion. The state dictated when its citizens could wed, and the schedule was anything but romantic. Men were forbidden to marry until the age of 30, a full decade after they had begun their brutal military training in the Agoj. By this age, a Spartan man had endured years of starvation, exposure, flogging, and psychological conditioning. He had proven his loyalty not to family, but to the polis. Only then was he deemed worthy of assuming the responsibilities of husband and father. Marriage, in this context, was not a rite of passage into adulthood. It was a reward for survival. Women, by contrast, married much younger, typically in their late teens or early 20s. This was no accident. Spartan girls were raised with the same emphasis on physical strength as boys. From childhood, they ran, wrestled, threw javelins and danced in competitive festivals, all to build endurance, agility, and robust health. Their bodies were not cultivated for beauty, but for childbirth. By marrying young, they entered their most fertile years under the watchful eye of the state, ensuring that Sparta's demographic engine never stalled. The age gap seasoned warriors paired with youthful athletic women was a calculated strategy. It maximized the likelihood of producing vigorous offspring while reinforcing the hierarchy of experience and duty. The husband brought discipline, the wife brought vitality. Together they formed a biological unit in service to the state, the bride's transformation, shaved, cloaked, and reborn. Perhaps the most jarring ritual in the Spartan wedding was the preparation of the bride. On the eve of her marriage, a Spartan girl did not don a flowing gown or weave flowers into her hair. Instead, she underwent a symbolic erasure of femininity. Her head was shaved completely. Her long hair, often a symbol of beauty and status in the ancient world, was cut away, leaving her scalp bare. She was then dressed not in bridal finery, but in a man's cloak and simple sandals. In this moment, she ceased to be a maiden and became something else entirely, a figure of androgynous strength, resembling a young warrior more than a delicate bride. This transformation served multiple purposes. First, it reflected Sparta's deep disdain for vanity and luxury. Jewelry, perfume, and elaborate hairstyles were seen as signs of softness traits antithetical to the Spartan ideal. By stripping the bride of ornamentation, the state ensured that the union rested on character and capability, not appearance. Second, the disguise blurred traditional gender roles. In a society that demanded resilience from both sexes, the bride's masculine attire signalled that she was not a passive dependent, but an equal partner in duty. She was expected to endure hardship, manage estates, and raise children with the same fortitude her husband showed on the battlefield. Third, the ritual eased the groom's transition. Accustomed to a life spent almost exclusively among men in barracks, the young Spartan warrior might have found the shift to heterosexual intimacy jarring. Presenting his bride in a form that echoed male camaraderie softened this psychological leap, bridging the gap between military brotherhood and marital partnership. Over time, her hair would grow back, and she would assume the full role of wife and mother. But the message of that first night remained indelible. This marriage was not about romance, it was about resilience. The ritual abduction. A wedding as a military operation. With her head shaved and her body cloaked in masculine garb, the bride was then secretly abducted by her groom. This was not a violent kidnapping, but a staged ritual, a symbolic reenactment of capture that echoed Sparta's martial ethos. The groom would seize his bride from her family home under cover of darkness and carry her to a private chamber, often within his barracks or a secluded dwelling. The act was witnessed by no one. There were no processions, no feasts, no public celebrations. In other Greek cities, weddings were joyous, communal events filled with music, dancing, and days of feasting. In Sparta, the union began in silence and secrecy. This was deliberate. Extravagance was weakness. Public display was vanity. The bond between husband and wife was not meant for spectacle, but for private strength. The abduction also reinforced the idea that marriage was a form of conquest, not of love, but of duty. The woman was not given in marriage, she was taken into service of the state. Her old identity, daughter, sister, maiden, was left behind. From this moment, she belonged to Sparta. Life after the wedding. Separation as strategy. Even after the wedding night, the couple did not begin life together in the way we imagine marriage today. The groom returned to his military barracks, where he was required to live until the age of 30. For years he would visit his wife only in secret, slipping into her quarters at night and returning before dawn. This arrangement was not born of neglect, but of ideological design. It ensured that a man's primary loyalty remained with his fellow warriors and the state, not with his household. Marriage was subordinate to military service. The barracks came first, the bedroom second. For the bride, this separation was both isolating and empowering. While Athenian wives were confined to the gyneceum, women's quarters, rarely seen in public and excluded from economic life, Spartan women managed entire estates. With their husbands absent, they oversaw enslaved helots, directed agricultural production, handled finances, and made critical decisions about land and labour. By some estimates, Spartan women eventually controlled nearly 40% of the land in Laconia, a staggering figure in the ancient patriarchal world. Thus, Spartan marriage created a paradox. It was emotionally distant, yet economically egalitarian. The wife was not a companion in the modern sense, but a co-steward of the household, entrusted with responsibilities that granted her unusual influence and autonomy. Children, the ultimate measure of success. In Sparta, a marriage was judged not by affection, longevity, or harmony, but by offspring. The birth of a healthy son was the highest achievement. He would one day enter the agoge, endure its trials, and if he survived, become a full Spartan citizen and soldier. Daughters, too, were valued not as burdens, but as future mothers of warriors. Their physical training in youth was not for show. It was preparation for the rigours of childbirth and the demands of raising strong children. If a marriage failed to produce children, it was considered a public failure, not a private misfortune. The state might intervene directly. An older or infertile husband could permit his wife to conceive with a younger, stronger man, a practice that would have scandalized Athens, but was seen in Sparta as pragmatic and patriotic. Some sources even suggest that men would lend their wives to particularly fit warriors to ensure the best possible genetic outcome. Reproduction was treated with the same strategic seriousness as battlefield tactics. Newborns faced immediate scrutiny. Elders examined each infant for signs of strength, symmetry, and vigour. Those deemed weak, deformed, or sickly were taken to the slopes of Mount Taygetus and left to die a practice known as apathetes, the exposure. Harsh as it seems, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the logical extension of Sparta's core belief. Only the strong deserve to survive. The mother's role: return with your shield or on it. Spartan mothers were legendary for their toughness. The most famous saying attributed to them, "Return with your shield or on it," encapsulated the entire ethos of Spartan life. To come home victorious was honourable. To die in battle carried on your shield was noble. But to discard your shield and flee, that was unforgivable. This attitude extended into marriage. A Spartan wife was expected to raise her sons without sentimentality, to harden them for war, and to accept their deaths as the price of citizenship. Grief was not forbidden, but weakness was. And yet, for all its severity, This system granted Spartan women a voice and agency unmatched in the Greek world. They spoke openly in public, owned property, and shaped the moral and economic fabric of the city. While men fought, women held Sparta together. Marriage as a mirror of the state. In the end, Spartan marriage was not a private institution. It was a microcosm of the state itself, austere, disciplined, and relentlessly focused on survival. Every custom, from the shaved head to the secret visits, reflected the values that made Sparta formidable. Self-denial, collective duty, and the subordination of the individual to the whole. Love may have existed in the quiet spaces between duty, but it was never the point. The point was Sparta, and as long as the city endured, marriage would remain not a celebration of two souls, but a forge for the future of war. Contrary to the popular image of Vikings as grimy, mud-smeared berserkers roaring from dragon-prowed longships with blood in their eyes and filth in their beards, the Norsemen of the Viking Age, roughly 793–1066 CE, were in fact remarkably fastidious about personal hygiene. Far from wallowing in grime, they carried grooming kits, bathed regularly, and placed immense cultural value on well-kept hair, clean clothing, and fresh breath. To the Vikings, cleanliness wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a mark of honour, social standing, and even seduction. Archaeological evidence from burial sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and Russia has unearthed an astonishing array of personal care items. Combs carved from antler or bone, earwax scoops, tweezers, nail cleaners, razors, and even toothpicks. These weren't rare luxuries reserved for chieftains. They'd been found in the graves of common warriors, farmers, and traders alike. The comb in particular appears with such frequency that it's considered one of the most iconic artifacts of Viking material culture. Many were intricately decorated with interlacing patterns or mythological motifs, suggesting they were both functional and symbolic, perhaps even talismans of order in a chaotic world. But grooming wasn't just about vanity. In Norse society, a well-groomed appearance signalled self-respect and discipline qualities essential for a warrior expected to face death with dignity. The Icelandic sagas, written centuries later but rooted in oral traditions of the Viking Age, repeatedly emphasise the importance of neatness. In Egil's saga, the hero pauses mid-battle preparations to wash his hair and change into clean clothes before confronting his enemies, not out of vanity, but to meet his fate looking like a man of worth. Similarly, in Njal's saga, a character is mocked not for cowardice, but for having unkempt hair, a sign of moral decay. Bathing, weekly rituals and sauna culture. The Vikings didn't just rinse off in rivers when convenient, they bathed at least once a week, typically on Saturdays, a practice so ingrained that in Old Norse, the word for Saturday Logadasia literally means bathing day, Logbath or pool Dagaday. This custom was so widespread that when Vikings settled in England and Normandy, they influenced local habits. In fact, the English word Saturday may have been reinforced by Norse usage. Bathing often took place in natural hot springs, rivers, or purpose-built wooden bathhouses heated by stones. In Iceland and Norway, geothermal activity provided ready-made hot pools, while in other regions families used large wooden tubs filled with water heated over open fires. Some elite households even had sauna-like steam rooms, precursors to the Finnish loili, where heat and steam were used to open pores and cleanse the skin. These weren't just for hygiene, they were social spaces, where men and women, often separately, discussed news, forged alliances and relaxed after long sea voyages. Arab travellers, whose accounts provide some of the most vivid outsider perspectives on Viking life, were both fascinated and repulsed by Norse bathing habits. The 10th century diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Rus Vikings, Norse traders on the Volga River, wrote with a mix of admiration and horror, "They are the filthiest of God's creatures, but every morning each man washes his face and head in a basin of water and combs his hair with a comb." His contradiction reveals a cultural clash. While Ibn Fadlan found their communal hygiene practices crude, they shared basins and blew their noses into the same water, he couldn't deny their daily commitment to cleanliness, a stark contrast to many contemporary European societies where full body washing was rare. Hair, beards, and the politics of appearance for Vikings. Hair was a canvas of identity. Men typically wore their hair long in the back and short in the front, often tied or braided, while beards were full but meticulously maintained. Warriors might braid their beards before battle not for decoration, but to keep them out of their eyes and prevent enemies from grabbing them in hand-to-hand combat. Yet even in war, grooming mattered. A tangled, lice-ridden beard wasn't just uncomfortable, it was shameful. Women's hairstyles were equally elaborate. They often wore their hair in complex braids, sometimes wrapped around their heads or pinned with decorative brooches. Unmarried women wore their hair loose or in a single braid. Married women covered theirs with scarves or hoods, but always after careful brushing and oiling. Hair wasn't just aesthetic. It indicated marital status, age, and regional origin. And yes, Vikings dyed their hair. Blonde was highly prized, especially among men in Norse poetry and myth. Odin himself is described as fair-haired. Dark-haired Vikings, particularly in Denmark and Sweden, would bleach their hair using a strong soap made from lye and goat fat, which lightened strands and also acted as a lice deterrent. Women used herbal rinses chamomile, saffron, or even urine, which contains ammonia, to enhance shine or add golden tones. Dental care and the mystery of filed teeth. Viking dental hygiene was pragmatic, if not always effective. They used chew sticks, frayed twigs that acted like primitive toothbrushes, and toothpicks made of bone or wood. Some evidence suggests they cleaned their teeth with charcoal or crushed herbs, similar to medieval tooth powders. While their diet rich in dairy, fish and grains was less cavity-prone than modern sugar-heavy fare, tooth decay and gum disease were still common. But the most enigmatic dental practice was tooth filing. Archaeologists have discovered Viking skulls, mostly male with horizontal grooves deliberately carved into the front teeth. These aren't signs of wear or disease. They're precise, symmetrical, and likely done with a fine file. Some theories suggest this was war paint for the mouth, a way to appear more fearsome in battle, especially if the grooves were filled with red pigment, traces of which have been found in a few cases. Others argue it was a status marker, like tattoos, signalling membership in a warrior brotherhood or successful raiding experience. Whatever the reason, it underscores a key truth. Vikings modified their bodies intentionally, not randomly. Every scar, braid, and filed tooth carried meaning. Clothing and clean linen. Viking clothing was made from wool, linen, and occasionally silk, imported via trade routes. While outer garments might be worn for days during travel or battle, undergarments were changed regularly. Linen shifts and undershirts were washed frequently, as linen was valued for its absorbency and ease of cleaning. Wealthier Vikings owned multiple sets of clothing and used soapwort plants or alkaline lye soaps to launder them. Clean clothes also played a role in courtship. The Poetic Edda includes verses where a woman rejects a suitor not for his lack of wealth, but because he's dirty and unkempt. Conversely, a man who arrives at a feast in freshly washed garments and combed hair is described as worthy of honour. In a society where reputation was everything, poor hygiene was a social liability. The lice paradox: despite their grooming habits, Vikings did suffer from lice, as did virtually every pre-modern population. Combs often have lice and nits embedded in their teeth, proving they were used for delousing. But this doesn't contradict their cleanliness. It simply reflects the reality of life before insecticides. The fact that they carried fine-toothed combs everywhere, even on long sea voyages, shows they actively fought infestations. Their solution wasn't neglect, but constant maintenance. Legacy. Clean conquerors. When Vikings raided monasteries or settled in foreign lands, their appearance often surprised locals. Anglo-Saxon and Frankish chroniclers, expecting savage brutes, instead described men who combed their hair daily and washed after battle. This dissonance between expectation and reality reveals how deeply the dirty barbarian stereotype was a projection of cultural bias, not historical fact. In truth, the Vikings understood something fundamental. Cleanliness and ferocity are not mutually exclusive. A man could raid a monastery at dawn and scrub his beard by dusk. He could carve runes into his sword and still oil his hair before a feast. Their grooming rituals weren't a rejection of violence, they were a refinement of it. To be a true Viking wasn't to reject civilization, but to master both chaos and order on the battlefield and in the bathhouse. And so, the next time you picture a Viking, don't imagine a grizzled brute caked in mud. Imagine a man with a bone comb in his belt, a freshly braided beard, and the quiet pride of someone who knows that even in a world of blood and ice, dignity begins with a clean face. In the highlands of central Mexico, long before the arrival of Spanish galleons and steel-clad conquistadors, a different kind of warfare unfolded. Not for territory, not for plunder, but for blood. Not the blood of enemies in the conventional sense, but blood as sacred offering, as cosmic fuel, as the very essence that kept the sun rising and the world from collapsing into eternal night. This was the Xochitl, the flower. War, a form of ritualized combat practiced by the Aztec Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco and Tlacopan, and their designated rivals, most notably the city-states of Tlaxcala, Huejotzingo and Cholula. To modernize, the concept may seem paradoxical. A war declared not to conquer but to capture, not to kill on the battlefield but to preserve life only to end it later on the altar. Yet within the Aztec cosmological framework, this made perfect, even urgent sense. The universe, they believed, was sustained by sacrifice. The gods had bled to create the world. Now, humanity owed a debt that could only be repaid in kind. At the heart of this belief stood Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec patron deity of sun and war. According to myth, he was born fully armed from the womb of his mother, Coatlicue, and immediately slew his sister Coyolxauhqui and 400 brothers to defend her. His victory was not just familial, it was cosmic. Each dawn, Huitzilopochtli waged war against the forces of darkness, and each sunset was a near defeat. To ensure he rose again, he needed nourishment. Human hearts, still beating, offered in ritual sacrifice atop the great temple of Tenochtitlan. But where would these sacrificial victims come from? The Aztecs could not simply slaughter their own citizens that would weaken the state. Nor could they rely solely on prisoners from conventional wars, which were unpredictable and often destructive. The solution was elegant if chilling. a standing agreement with rival city-states to engage in scheduled ceremonial battles, the Flower Wars, the pact of blood and honour. Unlike total war, which aimed at annihilation or subjugation, the Flower War was prearranged. Diplomats from opposing cities would meet, often under truce, to agree on the date of battle, the location, usually a neutral field or sacred site, the number of warriors each side would send. These were not ambushes or raids. They were duels of honour, fought with agreed-upon rules and mutual understanding. Both sides knew the purpose: to test martial skill, demonstrate divine favour, and above all take captives. Crucially, the enemy cities involved in Flower Wars were never fully conquered, even when the Aztecs held military superiority. Tlaxcala, for example, remained independent throughout the height of the Aztec Empire, despite being completely surrounded by allied territory. Why? Because Tlaxcala was not an enemy to be erased. It was a sacred opponent, a partner in the cosmic drama of sacrifice. Destroying them would be like extinguishing the flame you need to keep your hearth alive. The battlefield as temple. On the appointed day, warriors from both sides gathered at dawn, painted in ritual colours, ochre, black and turquoise, and adorned with feathered headdresses, jaguar pelts, or eagle motifs symbolising their warrior orders. They carried maquiahetl wooden swords embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades capable of decapitating a horse and schmally, round shields, decorated with divine symbols. But here's the twist. Killing an opponent on the field was discouraged. The goal was not to slay, but to subdue and capture. A warrior would grapple his foe, pin him to the ground, and drag him alive back to his own lines. The more captives a warrior took, the higher his status. Elite fighters, known as Quauhquelotl, eagle-jaguar warriors, wore elaborate regalia earned through repeated success in capturing enemies. Death on the battlefield was considered a lesser fate. True glory came from delivering a living offering to the priests, and for the captive this was not seen as mere execution. In Aztec belief, to be sacrificed was to become one with the gods, a sacred honour. Some captives even went willingly, believing they would join Huitzilopochtli in the sun's daily journey across the sky. Training, prestige, and social mobility. The Flower Wars served another critical function: military training and social advancement. For young Aztec men, especially those not born into nobility, success in combat was the primary path to status. Unlike hereditary aristocracies in Europe, the Aztec military offered a meritocratic ladder. A commoner who captured 4 enemies could rise to the rank of Tlaquetecatl, captain, and enjoy privileges once reserved for elites. Training began in the Telpochcali, House of Youth, where boys learned discipline, weapon handling, and the sacred songs of war. The Flower Wars provided a controlled environment to test these skills without the chaos of total war. It was, in essence, combat as curriculum, a blend of physical trial, spiritual duty, and civic service. Criticism and strategic reality. Modern scholars debate whether the Flower Wars were purely religious or also served strategic purposes. Some argue they functioned as a form of psychological warfare, keeping rival states in a state of perpetual tension without full-scale invasion. Others suggest they were a way to drain enemy resources, forcing Tlaxcalans to constantly mobilize troops, harvest less, and remain isolated. There's also evidence that as the empire grew, the scale of sacrifice increased dramatically. During the dedication of the Great Temple in 1487, it's claimed that 20,000 captives were sacrificed over 4 days, a number likely exaggerated but indicative of immense demand. The flower wars may have evolved from spiritual ritual into a system of ritualized resource extraction, feeding an ever-hungrier sacrificial machine. Critics within Mesoamerica certainly existed. The Tlaxcalans, though participants, deeply resented the arrangement. When Hernan Cortés arrived in 1519, they allied with him not out of admiration for Spain, but out of centuries of accumulated hatred for Aztec dominance. To them the flower wars were not sacred. They were oppression disguised as piety, collapse and legacy. When the Spanish dismantled the Aztec Empire, they were horrified by the scale of human sacrifice, but they also misunderstood its logic. To the conquistadors, it was proof of barbarism. To the Aztecs, it was cosmic necessity. The flower wars were not cruelty for its own sake. They were an attempt to stave off apocalypse through disciplined, ritualized violence. After the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the flower wars ceased. The temples were razed, the priesthood destroyed, and the old gods replaced. Yet the memory endured not just in codices and colonial chronicles, but in the very soil of Mexico, where obsidian blades and ritual altars still surface after rains. Today, the flower wars challenge us to confront a difficult truth. Violence can be sacred, not in the sense of being good, but in the sense of being meaningful within a cultural framework. The Aztecs did not wage these wars out of bloodlust. They did so out of duty, fear, and love for their gods, their world, and the fragile order that held back the night. In the end, the flower war was not a contradiction. It was a prayer in motion, a battlefield turned altar, where every captured breath was offered to keep the sun alive. Long before Europe's first public hospitals emerged from monastic charity, a quiet revolution in medical care was unfolding across the Islamic world. From Baghdad to Cairo, Damascus to Cordoba, a network of institutions known as Bimaristans, from the Persian bimar, sick, and stan, place, rose as beacons of rational medicine, compassionate care, and scientific inquiry. These were not merely shelters for the dying or way stations for pilgrims, as many early Christian hospices were. They were fully functioning hospitals centuries ahead of their time, where patients received diagnosis, treatment, surgery, and even psychiatric care all free of charge, regardless of religion, gender, or social status. The Bimaristan was more than a building. It was a philosophical statement that healing was a sacred duty, that knowledge must serve humanity, and that illness, whether of body or mind, deserved dignity, not shame. In an age often mischaracterized as stagnant or superstitious, the Islamic world built institutions that would not be matched in Europe for another 500 years. Origins and inspiration. The concept of the Bimaristan emerged in the 8th and 9th centuries, during the Abbasid Caliphate, a golden age of translation, scholarship, and cross-cultural exchange. Inspired by earlier Persian ambaristans, royal infirmaries, and influenced by Greek medical texts, especially the works of Hippocrates and Galen, preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars. The first true Bimaristan was founded in Baghdad in 805 CE by Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his vizier Yahya ibn Khalid. But this was no act of mere charity. It was state policy. The Abbasid rulers understood that a healthy population was essential for a stable empire. They invested heavily in public health, sanitation, and medical education. The Bimaristan became a cornerstone of this vision, a place where theory met practice, and where the sick were not abandoned but studied, treated and often cured. Architecture of healing. Bimaristans were architectural marvels designed with both function and tranquility in mind. Typically built around a central courtyard with a fountain or garden, they followed principles of environmental medicine long before the term existed. Fresh air, natural light, running water and greenery were not luxuries, they were therapeutic necessities. Wards were segregated by specialty. One for fevers, another for eye diseases, a third for surgical cases, and remarkably a dedicated ward for mental illness. This was revolutionary. While medieval Europe often chained the mentally ill in dungeons or accused them of demonic possession, Islamic physicians like Al-Razi, Razes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, viewed mental disorders as medical conditions, treatable with baths, music therapy, conversation, and herbal remedies. Each ward had its own staff, pharmacy, and teaching space. Patients stayed until fully recovered, sometimes for weeks or months with food, bedding, and medicine provided at state expense. Upon discharge, they were even given a small stipend to help them reintegrate into society. Medical innovation and education. Perhaps the most groundbreaking aspect of the Bimaristan was its role as a teaching hospital. Long before the University of Paris or Bologna established medical faculties, Bimaristans functioned as clinical training centres where students learned by observing, assisting, and eventually performing procedures under supervision. The curriculum was rigorous. Students studied anatomy, often through animal dissection since human dissection was restricted, pharmacology, surgery, and diagnostics. They learned to take detailed case histories, monitor symptoms over time, and differentiate between diseases with similar presentations, a practice that laid the groundwork for modern clinical medicine. Physicians like Al-Zahrawi, Abul-Qasis, working in 10th century Cordoba, used the Bimaristan to develop over 200 surgical instruments, many of which, such as forceps, scalpels, and catgut sutures, are still in use today. His 30-volume medical encyclopedia, Al-Tasrif, became a standard text in Europe for centuries. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, Al-Razi famously diagnosed a new disease, smallpox, by carefully distinguishing its symptoms from measles, a feat of clinical observation unmatched in its time. He also pioneered the use of controlled trials. When tasked with choosing a location for a new hospital, he hung pieces of meat in different districts and selected the site where the meat decomposed slowest, reasoning that cleaner air would mean better health outcomes. Universal access and ethical care. One of the most striking features of the Bimaristan was its inclusivity. Patients were admitted regardless of faith. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and pagans all received equal care. This was not tolerance as an afterthought, but a core Islamic principle. The Quran commands believers to care for the sick, and the Prophet Muhammad said, "The best among you are those who bring benefit to others." Women were not only treated but also employed as physicians. Historical records mention female doctors like Rufaida al-Aslamiyah, who led mobile field hospitals during early Islamic battles and later trained other women in nursing and wound care. In some Bimaristans, female patients were attended exclusively by female staff, a practice rooted in modesty, yet also empowering for women in medicine. Payment was never a barrier. The Bimaristan was funded by Waqf Islamic charitable endowments, often established by caliphs, merchants, or scholars who donated land or revenue to ensure perpetual care for the sick. This system created a sustainable, non-profit model of healthcare that prioritized need over wealth. Legacy and decline. For over 600 years, Bimaristans flourished across the Islamic world. The Nur al-Din Bimaristan in Damascus, 1154 CE, and the Kalawun complex in Cairo, 1285 CE, were among the grandest housing libraries, lecture halls, and even convalescent gardens. Travellers like Ibn Battuta marvelled at their efficiency and compassion. But as political fragmentation, Mongol invasions, and later colonial disruptions weakened the Islamic world, many Bimaristans fell into disrepair or were repurposed. Their knowledge, however, lived on, translated into Latin during the 12th century renaissance of translation in places like Toledo, Spain. The works of Ibn Sina, al-Razi, and al-Zahrawi became the foundation of European medical education. The word hospital itself may derive from the Arabic Bimaristan via medieval Latin. Yet the true legacy of the Bimaristan is not just in instruments or texts, it's in its ethos. It proved that science and faith could coexist, that compassion could be systematized, and that healing was not a privilege but a right. In a world still grappling with healthcare inequality, the Bimaristan stands as a haunting reminder. A society is measured not by its wealth, but by how it treats its sickest members. In the shadowed parlours of 19th century Britain, grief was not a private emotion, it was a public performance, meticulously choreographed, socially mandated, and economically lucrative. When Queen Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, the monarch didn't just mourn, she redefined mourning itself. Her decades-long seclusion in Black Creek, her refusal to attend state functions, and her obsessive preservation of Albert's rooms transformed personal sorrow into a national aesthetic. What followed was not merely a period of sadness, but the rise of an elaborate, rigid, and often suffocating culture of mourning that dictated everything from fabric choices to social eligibility for nearly half a century. To be in mourning in the Victorian era was to enter a state of ritualised exile, one governed by unwritten rules so complex they required etiquette manuals, mourning warehouses, and even specialised jewellery. This was not spontaneous grief. It was grief as duty, grief as fashion, and for many grief as financial burden. The hierarchy of sorrow, rules for every relationship. Victorian mourning was not monolithic. It operated on a strict hierarchy of loss, with prescribed durations and dress codes based on your relationship to the deceased. The closer the bond, the longer and darker the mourning. Full or deep mourning lasted 1 year and 1 day for a widow. During this time she wore only matte black wool or crepe, devoid of ornamentation, lace, or shine. Even her undergarments were expected to be black. Mirrors in the home were draped in black cloth. Clocks were stopped at the hour of death. Second mourning, months 13 to 18, allowed for slight softening. Black silk, subtle trim, perhaps jet buttons, but still no colour. Half mourning, months 19 to 24, introduced muted tones, lavender, grey, mauve or white, signalling a gradual re-entry into society. Only then could a widow attend a dinner party or wear a hint of jewellery. For other relationships, the timeline shortened but remained precise. Parents or children, 6 to 12 months. Siblings, 3 to 6 months. Aunts, uncles, 2-3 months. Distant cousins, a few weeks, if observed at all. Failure to adhere to these norms invited social censure. A woman seen in grey too soon might be labelled heartless. A man who resumed socialising after his wife's death could be deemed unfeeling, or, worse, eager to remarry for convenience. The mourning industry, death as commerce. This elaborate ritual did not exist in a vacuum. It fueled a booming industry, one that turned death into big business. Mourning warehouses like Jay's in London or Besson's in Paris offered everything a bereaved family might need. Black dresses, often rented, as full mourning wardrobes were prohibitively expensive. Veils, gloves, stationery edged in black, and even mourning tea sets with sombre floral patterns. Catalogues listed widow's weeds alongside half-mourning bonnets, all priced to match one's social standing. Then there was mourning jewellery, a macabre yet deeply sentimental art form. Lockets containing hair from the deceased were common, but more elaborate pieces featured woven hair portraits, miniature coffins in glass cases, or brooches shaped like weeping willows over graves. The most prized material was jet, a fossilised coal mine near Whitby, England, carved into crosses, urns and teardrops. Queen Victoria herself wore a jet brooch containing Albert's hair for the rest of her life, making it a must-have accessory for the grieving elite. Photography, too, was enlisted in the service of mourning. Post-mortem photography became a standard practice, especially for children. Families would pose with their deceased loved one, propped upright, eyes painted open, hands folded as if merely sleeping. These images, often the only photograph ever taken of the person, were cherished as sacred relics. To modern eyes they are haunting. To Victorians they were acts of love. The widow's cage, social and sexual confinement. For women, mourning was especially constraining. A widow in deep mourning was socially invisible, expected to decline invitations, avoid public events, and speak only in hushed tones. Yet paradoxically, she was also hyper-visible, her black attire marking her as a figure of pity, scrutiny, or even suspicion. Remarriage during mourning was taboo, seen as a betrayal of the dead. A widow who dared to court again before the 2-year mark risked scandal. This created a liminal existence, no longer a wife, not yet free. Many widows, especially those without independent means, found themselves trapped in dependency on in-laws, brothers or charity. Yet for some, mourning offered unexpected autonomy. Freed from the duties of wifely obedience but not yet bound by a new marriage, a widow could manage her own finances, travel, chaperoned of course, and even engage in philanthropy. Figures like Florence Nightingale, who never married but lived much of her life in quasi-mourning dress, used the aesthetic of solemnity to gain respect in male-dominated spheres. Men and mourning, a brief, silent grief. Men's mourning was far less elaborate but no less prescribed. A widower typically wore a black armband or black suit for 3 months, then resumed normal life. There was no expectation of emotional display. In fact, stoicism was valorized. A man who wept openly risked being seen as weak or unmanly. This brevity reflected Victorian gender norms. Men were the pillars of society, expected to suppress emotion and maintain order. Their grief was internalized, often channeled into work or drink. The disparity was stark. While a widow might mourn for 2 years, her husband's mourning lasted barely long enough to dry his tears. The decline of deep mourning. By the 1890s, the rigid codes began to soften. Urbanization, changing gender roles, and the sheer exhaustion of perpetual grief led to shorter mourning periods and more flexible attire. The rise of department stores democratized fashion, making black dresses accessible without specialized mourning shops. World War I delivered the final blow. With millions dead, full mourning became logistically and emotionally impossible. How could an entire nation wear black for a generation? grief had to be streamlined, internalized and privatized. The elaborate theatre of Victorian mourning gave way to the quieter, more personal expressions of the 20th century. Legacy. When grief becomes ritual. The Victorian mourning era reveals a profound truth. How we grieve is never just personal. It's cultural, political, and economic. In an age of rapid industrialization, scientific advancement, and religious doubt, mourning rituals offered certainty in the face of chaos. They gave structure to loss, meaning to absence, and visibility to love. But they also exposed the era's contradictions. A society that prized sentiment yet commodified sorrow, that revered women's purity yet confined them in fabric prisons, that celebrated progress while clinging to the dead. Today, we may scoff at the absurdity of jet brooches and post-mortem photos. But in our own ways, through social media memorials, memorial tattoos, or the quiet ritual of visiting a grave, we too perform our grief. The Victorians simply did it in full costume, with a script written in crape and tears. Long before Europe stirred from its post-Roman slumber, a quiet intellectual revolution was unfolding in the heart of Baghdad. At its centre stood a building that was far more than a library. It was a cosmos of human thought, a crucible where Greek philosophy met Persian astronomy, Indian mathematics fused with Arab poetry, and centuries of scattered knowledge were gathered, translated, preserved, and expanded. This was the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, and for over 2 centuries it stood as the brightest beacon of learning in the medieval world. Founded in the early 9th century by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and vastly expanded by his son al-Mamun, the House of Wisdom was not merely a royal vanity project. It was a deliberate act of civilizational ambition. The Abbasids, ruling an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Indus Valley, understood that power rested not just on armies and gold, but on knowledge. And so they built an institution unlike any the world had seen. Part library, part translation bureau, part research academy, and part observatory, all dedicated to the pursuit of hikmah, wisdom. The Great Translation Movement. The House of Wisdom's most enduring legacy was its role in the Greco-Arabic translation movement, a systematic, state-funded effort to translate the scientific and philosophical works of antiquity into Arabic. Teams of scholars, often working in pairs, scoured the remnants of the Byzantine, Persian, and Hellenistic worlds for manuscripts. They sought out texts by Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and Hippocrates, many of which had been lost or forgotten in the West. These were not literal word-for-word translations. The scholars of the House of Wisdom, many of them Nestorian Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Muslims working side by side, engaged deeply with the material. They corrected errors, filled gaps, added commentaries, and sometimes even improved upon the originals. A Greek text on optics might be enhanced with new experiments. A medical treatise could be updated with clinical observations from Baghdad's hospitals. The scale was staggering. Over 2 centuries, hundreds of texts were translated, copied, and disseminated across the Islamic world. Paper, introduced from China via Central Asia, made this possible cheap, durable, and far more practical than parchment or papyrus. The House of Wisdom became a publishing hub, its scriptoria humming with scribes who turned single manuscripts into dozens of copies, ensuring that knowledge spread not just to elites, but to scholars in Cairo, Cordoba, and Samarkand. Scholars who shaped the world. The House of Wisdom attracted some of the greatest minds of the age. Among them was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian physician and linguist often called the father of Arab medicine. Fluent in Syriac, Greek, Arabic, and Persian, Hunayn didn't just translate Galen, he reconstructed him, comparing multiple Greek manuscripts to produce the most accurate version possible. His translations became the standard medical texts for 800 years. Then there was Al-Khwarizmi, the mathematician whose name gave us the word algorithm. Working at the House of Wisdom, he synthesized Indian numerals, including the revolutionary concept of zero with Greek geometry to create algebra, Al-Jabr. His book on the calculation with Hindu numerals introduced the decimal system to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, where it replaced the clumsy Roman numerals. Astronomers like Alfagani refined Ptolemy's models, calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy, and designed instruments that would later guide European navigators across the Atlantic. Philosophers like Al-Kindi, known as the philosopher of the Arabs, argued that reason and revelation were compatible, a radical idea that would later influence Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic movement. More than a library, a living academy. Unlike static repositories of scrolls, the House of Wisdom was a dynamic intellectual community. Scholars debated in its courtyards, conducted experiments in its laboratories, and taught students in its lecture halls. It was one of the first institutions where theory met practice on a grand scale. The caliphs themselves often participated. Al-Ma'mun, a passionate patron of science, reportedly appeared in dreams to Aristotle, prompting him to fund even more translations. He also commissioned the first large-scale measurement of the Earth's circumference, sending survey teams across the Mesopotamian plains with ropes and astrolabes. Their result, 24,000 miles, was only 3 off the modern value. The House of Wisdom also housed an observatory where astronomers tracked planetary movements, compiled star catalogues, and challenged ancient assumptions. Their work laid the foundation for Copernicus and Kepler centuries later. The preservation of lost worlds. Perhaps the House of Wisdom's greatest gift to humanity was preservation. Many Greek texts that survive today exist only because they were translated into Arabic. Works by Aristotle on ethics, Galen on anatomy, and Archimedes on mechanics were lost in the original Greek but kept alive in Arabic versions later retranslated into Latin during the 12th century Renaissance in Europe. Without the House of Wisdom, the European Renaissance might never have happened. When scholars in Toledo, Sicily and Paris began rediscovering classical knowledge in the 1100s, they did so through Arabic intermediaries. The works of Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, both deeply influenced by the intellectual tradition of the House of Wisdom, became required reading in medieval universities. Decline and legacy. The House of Wisdom's golden age ended with the Mongol siege of Baghdad in 1258. When Hulagu Khan's armies breached the city walls, they destroyed libraries, burned books, and according to legend, threw so many manuscripts into the Tigris River that the water ran black with ink for days. The physical House of Wisdom was gone, but its spirit endured. The knowledge it cultivated had already spread across continents. Its methods, critical inquiry, empirical observation, cross-cultural synthesis, became the bedrock of the scientific method. Today, the House of Wisdom stands as a powerful symbol. Civilizations thrive not by hoarding knowledge, but by sharing it. In an age of division, it reminds us that the greatest advances happen not in isolation, but at the intersection of cultures, faiths, and languages, where a Christian translator, a Muslim mathematician, and a Jewish astronomer could sit together, not as rivals, but as fellow seekers of truth. The House of Wisdom was more than a building. It was a promise that human curiosity, when nurtured with generosity and rigor, can light the world even in the darkest of ages.